I'm too fat for you. The obese girl everyone mocked said, "Your body drives me wild," Mountain Man said. On a dusty frontier street, laughter roared as cruel voices jeered at a young woman for her size. The church bell tolled overhead, and the town waited for her to bow her head in shame. But instead, she shouted back words that silenced the crowd and changed her life forever. From the shadows stepped a scarred mountain rancher, a man no one dared cross. He tipped his hat to her, treating her with more respect than she had ever known. But in a town ruled by gossip and a railroad bent on stealing land, standing tall comes with a price. Barns will burn, jail keys will rattle, and whispers will turn to threats. She holds the proof that could free him and bring the railroad down, but will the same town that mocked her ever believe she's the one who holds the truth? Will her courage win justice and love, or will the cruelty of the West crush her for good? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The evening sun cast long shadows through the storehouse windows as Ella May pushed her untouched supper around her plate. The clinking of her fork against china echoed in the heavy silence. Her father, Thomas Dunn, sat rigid in his chair at the head of the table, his weathered face set in familiar lines of disappointment. "Ain't proper for a lady to make such scenes," he muttered, cutting his meat with sharp, angry strokes. "What'll folks say about the store now? About our family?" Ella's cheeks burned anew at the memory of her outburst. The flour sack she'd carried home now sat in the corner, a silent reminder of her humiliation. "I'm sorry, Pa. I just couldn't bear their cruel words anymore." Thomas's knife scraped against his plate. "Then you should have held your tongue and walked on by. That's what your mother would have done, God rest her soul." He paused, his voice softening slightly at the mention of his late wife. "You know how folks can be in this town. Best not to give them more reason to talk." The kitchen's familiar smells of coffee and fresh bread usually brought Ella comfort, but tonight they seemed to mock the bitter taste in her mouth. She thought of Alexander Boone's unexpected intervention, how he'd appeared like a guardian angel, his broad shoulders and quiet strength forming a shield between her and those jeering faces. "That Mountain Man had no business interfering," her father continued, as if reading her thoughts. "Stirring up more attention. And him, with that face full of scars, probably trouble. That one." Ella's hand tightened around her fork. "Mr. Boone was being kind, Pa. More Christian-like than those who were mocking me." "Kind?" Thomas scoffed. "Since when does kindness put food on the table or keep a business running? Speaking of which," he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "That railroad agent, Mr. Hale, came by the store again today. Mighty interested in our location." The abrupt change of subject made Ella's head spin. "Carter Hale. What did he want?" "Says the railroad's looking to expand their station. Needs more land for storage buildings." Thomas's voice took on a hopeful note. "Offered a fair price, too. Better than fair, considering." Ella pushed her plate away, appetite completely gone. "Considering what, Pa?" "Considering how things are changing. This town's growing, Ella May. Can't stay stuck in the past, running a little general store forever." He gestured at the ledger books stacked nearby Ella's domain, though he'd never admit how much he relied on her careful bookkeeping. Railroad means progress, means security. The word security hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ella knew her father worried about her future. An unmarried daughter was a burden, and her size made him doubt she'd ever find a husband. The thought brought fresh pain, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the practical matters at hand. "Did you look at the contract?" she asked, reaching for the paper. Her father pulled it back slightly. "Mr. Hale's a educated man, Ella May. Knows his business." "So do I," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "You taught me yourself how to read contracts, remember? After Mama died?" Thomas's face softened for a moment, then hardened again. "This ain't women's business. You focus on minding the store and keeping out of trouble." He stood, tucking the contract back into his vest. "And stay away from that Boone fellow. Last thing we need is more gossip." Ella remained at the table long after her father had gone upstairs to his room. Through the window, she could see the last rays of sunlight painting the distant mountains gold. Somewhere out there, Alexander Boone was probably making his way back to whatever solitary cabin he called home. She touched her cheek, remembering how he'd tipped his hat to her, treating her with a dignity that felt foreign and wonderful. The sound of boots on the boardwalk outside drew her attention. A group of men passed by, their voices carrying through the thin walls. She recognized Carter Hale's smooth tones among them. Just a matter of time. Old man Dunn'll see reason. They all do, eventually. Laughter followed, fading into the gathering dusk. Ella shivered, though the evening wasn't cold. She stood and began clearing the table, her movements precise and determined. Whatever her father thought, she wasn't about to let anyone railroad agent or otherwise take advantage of their family. In the dimness of the kitchen, she allowed herself a small smile, remembering Alexander's quiet strength. Perhaps there were still good men in the world, men who saw beyond appearances to the heart beneath. The thought warmed her as she went about her evening tasks, the familiar routine somehow lighter than before. As she closed up the storehouse for the rover, the sound of coyotes echoed from the distant hills. Ella paused at the door, looking out at the town's main street. The boardwalks were empty now, but she could still see the scene from earlier, the mocking faces, her own desperate outburst, and Alexander Boone's unexpected intervention. The memory no longer stung quite so sharply. "Lord," she whispered into the gathering darkness, "give me strength to face whatever's coming." She locked the door firmly, the key's turn echoing with a sound of finality. Upstairs, she could hear her father's heavy footsteps as he prepared for bed. The floorboards creaked familiar patterns, reminding her of all the nights they'd spent in this building since her mother's passing. The store below held their livelihood, their memories, their future. Whatever Carter Hale and his railroad had planned, Ella knew in her heart that some things were worth fighting for. She lit a small lamp and carried it to her room, where her writing desk waited. The ledger books her father had dismissed so easily contained stories of their own stories written in columns of numbers and careful notes. Ella ran her fingers over the latest entries, her mind already working through the implications of the railroad agent's offer. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she had work to do. The lamp's gentle light fell across the pages as Ella began to write, her pencil scratching quietly in the night's silence. Her father might see her as nothing more than a burden, but she knew better. In these books, in these numbers, she found a strength of her own, one that had nothing to do with size or appearance. Outside, the town settled into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone wolf called out, its voice echoing off the mountains. Ella paused in her work, listening. The sound reminded her, somehow, of Alexander Boone, wild and free, yet somehow reassuring. She smiled slightly and returned to her task, the numbers flowing beneath her pencil like a quiet prayer. Morning sunlight streamed through the store's front windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air as Ella stacked cans of peaches on the wooden shelves. The familiar scent of coffee brewing in the back room mingled with the sharp smell of leather from new work gloves and the sweetness of penny candy in glass jars. Every few minutes, the bell above the door would tinkle as customers came and went, their boots clomping across the plank floor. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar task, but her mind kept drifting back to yesterday's incident on the street. The memory of those cruel jeers still stung, but it was Alexander Boone's unexpected defense that kept replaying in her thoughts. No one had ever stood up for her like that before. "Mind those labels face forward," her father called from behind the counter, where he was updating the credit ledger. "And don't forget to check the dates on those preserves." "Yes, Pa," Ella responded, adjusting the cans. The routine tasks usually brought her comfort, but today she felt restless, aware of every creak of the floorboards, every distant whistle from the railroad yard. The door's bell chimed again. Ella's heart skipped as Alexander Boone's tall frame filled the doorway, morning light catching the silver threads in his dark hair. His scarred face looked less fearsome in the daylight, though no less striking. He removed his hat, revealing more of those distinctive scars that tracked down his neck. "Morning," he said, nodding to them both. His voice was quiet, but carried easily in the store's morning stillness. Thomas Dunn straightened behind the counter, his welcoming shopkeeper's smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Help you find something? Need some nails," Alexander replied, "and a sack of flour." He moved toward the hardware section, his movements careful in the narrow aisles, as if conscious of his size among the crowded shelves. Ella busied herself with the preserves, stealing glances as Alexander selected his items. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his manner direct but courteous. Nothing like the rough character her father had painted him as last night. "Heard you might have grazing land for lease," Alexander said as he placed his items on the counter. "Over by Cottonwood Creek?" Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. "Might do, depending on your intentions." "Looking to start a small cattle operation. Nothing fancy, but honest work." Alexander met the older man's gaze steadily. "Got some savings from my trapping days. Figure it's time to put down roots." Something in his tone made Ella pause in her work, listening more intently. The word roots seemed to carry extra weight, like a prayer or a promise. Thomas hesitated, then gestured to the coffee pot warming on the pot-bellied stove. "Might as well discuss it proper. Ella May, pour us some coffee." Ella moved to fetch cups, aware of Alexander's presence as she worked. His quiet, "Thank you," when she handed him the steaming cup, sent a warm flutter through her chest. As the men talked business, other customers drifted in and out of the store. 2 ranchers' wives gathered near the fabric counter, their whispered conversation catching Ella's attention. "Heard the railroad's buying up leases all over," one woman murmured. "Offering good money, too." "Too good, if you ask me," her companion replied. "My Henry says something's not right about those papers they're having folks sign." Ella moved closer to the counter where Alexander and her father sat, pretending to arrange a display of tin cups. Alexander was speaking softly about his plans for the land, but she noticed tension in his broad shoulders. When Thomas stepped away to help another customer, Alexander's expression shifted. He glanced at Ella, then spoke in a lower voice. "Miss Dunn, might I ask your opinion on something?" Ella moved closer, surprised. "Of course, Mr. Boone. Please, call me Alexander." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "You being good with numbers and all. That is, I noticed your father's ledger's looking mighty precise. Would you mind taking a look at this deed I signed? Something about it doesn't sit right." Warmth bloomed in Ella's chest at his words. Few people, especially men, ever acknowledged her skill with figures. "I'd be happy to help," she said softly. "Much obliged." His smile transformed his scarred face, making him look younger. "You've got the kind of sharp mind most men overlook. Their loss, I reckon." The compliment, delivered so matter-of-factly, made Ella's cheeks flush. She tucked the papers into her apron pocket just as her father returned. The rest of the day passed in a blur of customers and tasks, but Ella's thoughts kept returning to the weight of those papers in her pocket. When evening finally came and the last customer departed, she lit the lamp at the counter while her father counted the day's takings. "Don't stay up too late with those books," Thomas said as he headed upstairs. "And mind that lamp." "Yes, Pa. Good night." Once his footsteps faded, Ella pulled out Alexander's papers. The lamp's golden light illuminated the deed's careful script as she began to examine the document. Years of checking invoices and contracts had trained her eye to spot discrepancies, and something about these papers immediately caught her attention. The dates didn't align properly. The notary's stamp preceded the signing date by 3 days, and the signature of the witness. Ella frowned, comparing it to other portions of the document. The slant was wrong. The letters formed differently. Her heart began to beat faster as she spotted more irregularities. In the quiet store, surrounded by familiar smells of leather and coffee, Ella felt a surge of purpose. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was about helping someone who had shown her kindness when others showed only cruelty. She carefully folded the parent papers and tucked them into her ledger for safekeeping, already planning how to explain her findings to Alexander tomorrow. The lamp's flame flickered, casting moving shadows on the walls. Outside, a night bird called, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. Ella touched the ledger where Alexander's papers lay hidden, feeling the rough texture of the pages beneath her fingers. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly useful, valued for her mind rather than judged for her appearance. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. She had important news to share, and somehow she knew Alexander would listen, really listen to what she had to say. The thought warmed her as she extinguished the lamp and made her way upstairs, leaving the store to its nighttime silence. The day's events had shifted something inside her. Yesterday's shame had transformed into today's purpose, all because one scarred mountain man had seen past her size to recognize her worth. As she prepared for bed, Ella smiled, remembering Alexander's words about her sharp mind. Perhaps there was more to her story than being the overweight storekeeper's daughter. Perhaps Like Alexander with his plans for honest work and putting down roots, she too could build something meaningful from the solid foundation of who she truly was. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the Colorado air sharp with the bite of approaching autumn. Ella stood before her mirror, adjusting her best church bonnet with trembling fingers. The ribbon was faded, but she'd pressed her dress carefully the night before, determined to look her finest. A knock at the front door sent her heart racing. Through the window, she glimpsed Alexander's broad-shouldered figure on the porch, dressed in a clean black coat that made him look almost distinguished, despite his scars. "Ella May," her father called up the stairs, his voice tight with disapproval. "Mr. Boone is here to escort you to church." She descended the stairs, clutching her Bible and trying to project a confidence she didn't quite feel. Alexander stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, and his face softened when he saw her. "Miss Dunn," he said, offering his arm. "Might I have the honor?" Her father's frown deepened, but Ella placed her hand in the crook of Alexander's elbow, feeling the solid strength beneath his coat. Together, they stepped out into the morning sunshine. Main Street was busy with townspeople making their way to church, their Sunday best creating a parade of colors against the dusty backdrop. Whispers followed Ella and Alexander like autumn leaves in their wake. "Did you see? The Mountain man and the storekeeper's daughter." "Well, I never." Alexander's stride never faltered. He walked as if escorting a fine lady to a grand ball, his bearing proud and unhurried. Ella felt herself straightening, matching his dignity despite the cruel whispers. "Beautiful morning," Alexander commented, as if they were the only two people on the street. "Yes," Ella replied, finding her voice. "The aspens are starting to turn golden." They climbed the church steps together, Alexander's hand steady beneath her elbow. Inside, the whispers grew louder as they made their way down the aisle. Ella caught sight of the young men who had mocked her days before, their faces twisted with spite. But Alexander guided her to a pew near the front, helping her settle before taking his place beside her. The church filled quickly, the familiar sense of wood polish and Sunday perfume mixing with the morning air through the open windows. When Reverend Matthews took his place at the pulpit, his kind eyes swept over the congregation, lingering briefly on Ella and Alexander. "Today," the Reverend began, his voice filling the hushed space, "we speak of bearing one another's burdens." Ella felt the words settle deep in her chest. The Reverend spoke of Galatians, of how Christ called his people to help carry each other's loads, to see past appearances to the heart beneath. She was acutely aware of Alexander beside her, his scarred hands resting on his knees, his presence both strong and gentle. "For in helping others," Reverend Matthews continued, "we fulfill the law of Christ. When we lift our neighbor's burdens, we ourselves are lifted." Tears pricked at Ella's eyes. She thought of Alexander defending her, of his trust in showing her those papers, of his quiet recognition of her abilities. Was this what it meant to share burdens? After the final hymn, they made their way out into the churchyard. The autumn sun had warmed the air, and the breeze carried the scent of pine from the distant mountains. Alexander cleared his throat. "Miss Dunn," he said quietly, "I wonder if you might consider coming out to my ranch today? There are more papers I'd like you to look at." Ella hesitated. Her father stood across the churchyard, his disapproving glare burning into her back. But the memory of those irregular documents weighed on her mind, and Alexander's earnest expression spoke of trust freely given. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I would like that." Alexander's face brightened. "My wagon's just over yonder. It ain't much of a ride, but the road's a mite rough in places." He helped her into the wagon, tucking a blanket around her skirts against the autumn chill. The wooden seat was worn smooth with use, and Ella noticed there was only room for one person beside the driver, a lonely detail that spoke volumes. They set off at an easy pace, the wagon wheels creaking a steady rhythm. The town fell away behind them, replaced by rolling grassland dotted with pine and aspen. The wind carried the sharp scent of evergreen and the sweetness of late wildflowers. "Been meaning to fix up the place," Alexander said as they approached his ranch. "Just haven't had the time, what with trying to sort out these papers and all." The ranch house came into view, a small cabin with a roof that needed patching. The barn listed slightly to one side, its weathered boards telling stories of winter storms and summer Sunday. It wasn't much, but Ella could see the potential beneath the wear. Alexander helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and careful. Inside the cabin, the sparseness struck her immediately. One chair sat beside the pot-bellied stove. A single bedroll lay neat but lonely in the corner. The table held only the basics: one tin plate, one cup, one set of utensils. The sight made her heart ache. "Let me get a fire going," Alexander said, moving to the stove. "Got some stew left from yesterday. Ain't fancy, but it's filling." Ella watched as he worked, noting how he moved in the small space with the careful precision of a man used to being alone. She sat in the single chair he offered, despite his protests that she should take it. "I'm fine standing," he insisted, serving her a bowl of stew. "Been sitting in that wagon long enough." The stew was simple but good, flavored with wild herbs she recognized from the mountainside. As they ate, Alexander spread more documents on the table: land surveys, deed transfers, railroad proposals. Ella studied them carefully, her confidence growing as she spotted patterns in the irregularities. "Here," she said, pointing to a surveyor's mark. "See how the lines don't quite match? And the ink's different, newer than the rest. Someone's altered this mark." Alexander leaned close, his presence warm beside her. "You've got a real gift for this," he said softly. "Most folks wouldn't notice such things." The praise warmed her more than the stew had. Here, in this simple cabin with its single chair and lonely bedroll, she felt more valued than she ever had in town. Alexander wasn't just looking past her size. He was seeing her true worth, recognizing the sharp mind behind her plain exterior. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting golden squares on the rough wooden floor. In that, the moment, sharing Alexander's table and his trust, Ella felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just the storekeeper's overweight daughter anymore. She was someone who could help, someone who could make a difference. The forged surveyor's mark stood out starkly on the page between them, a symbol of the corruption they were uncovering together. But more than that, it was a bridge. A connection between a scarred mountain man and a woman who'd never quite fit in, both finding unexpected strength in each other's trust. The autumn sun had dipped low on the horizon when Alexander's wagon rolled back into town. Ella's heart felt lighter than it had in years, despite the growing darkness and cooling air. The time spent examining documents at Alexander's ranch had awakened something in her, a sense of purpose, of being truly useful. But that lightness vanished the moment she saw her father's silhouette in the doorway of their home above the store. He stood rigid, arms crossed, his face shadowed by the lamplight behind him. Ella's stomach twisted as Alexander helped her down from the wagon. "Much obliged for your help today, Miss Dunn," Alexander said softly, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing in the doorway. Before Ella could respond, her father's voice cut through the evening air like a whip. "Inside. Now." Alexander stiffened, but maintained his composure. "Good evening, Mr. Dunn. Your daughter's been a great help with inside." Her father's voice rose sharply. Ella hurried up the steps, her legs trembling. The warm memories of the afternoon crumbled under her father's fierce glare. As soon as she crossed the threshold, he slammed the door behind her. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his face flushed with anger. "Gallivanting around with that mountain man? Have you lost your mind?" "Father, I was just helping him with some documents." "Documents?" He spat the word. "Is that what they're calling it these days? Do you have any idea what people are saying?" Ella wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stand tall despite feeling smaller by the second. "I don't care what people say. Alexander needed help with..." "Alexander?" Her father's voice rose higher. "Oh, it's Alexander now, is it? Listen to me, girl. No Boone, or any other man, is ever going to truly want you. You're making a fool of yourself." The words struck like physical blows. Ella stumbled back, tears welling in her eyes. "He's different," she whispered. "He sees me for who I am." Her father laughed bitterly. "Who you are. You're my daughter, and you'll do as I say. I forbid you from helping that man again. Do you understand me? I forbid it." Ella fled to her room, closing the door quietly, despite her desire to slam it. She sank to her knees beside her bed, tears flowing freely now. The cruel words echoed in her mind, mixing with every taunt and jeer she'd ever endured. "Dear God," she whispered into her clasped hands. Why did you make me so different? Why couldn't I be like other girls? Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Everyone sees me as nothing but size and shame, even my own father. The floorboards creaked outside her door, but her father passed by without a word. Ella remained on her knees, prayer giving way to quiet tears until exhaustion finally pulled her into fitful sleep. Morning came too soon, the pale light creeping through her window, finding her still in yesterday's clothes. She washed her face with cold water, trying to erase the evidence of tears, and made her way down to the store. Her father barely acknowledged her as she began her usual morning tasks, sweeping the boardwalk, arranging displays, checking inventory. The bell above the door chimed mid-morning. Ella's heart leaped and sank simultaneously as Alexander stepped inside, his hat in his hands. He wore a clean shirt, his hair combed neat, looking every bit the respectable rancher despite the scars that marked his face. "Good morning, miss." "Done," he said warmly, then nodded to her father behind the counter. "Mr. Done." Her father's response was a grunt, his attention fixed on the ledger before him. Alexander approached the counter, standing tall and straight. "I wanted to return proper thanks for your daughter's help yesterday," he said clearly. "She's got a real gift for spotting things others miss." Those papers she examined. The ledger slammed shut with a crack that made Ella jump. Her father's face had turned a dangerous shade of red. "I thought I made myself clear last night," he growled. "You're not welcome here, Boone. Take your business elsewhere." Alexander didn't move. "Sir, your daughter's help matters more than you know. There's something wrong with those railroad contracts, and she's the only one who—" Her father's fist crashed down on the counter. "Get out!" he roared. "Get out of my store!" The silence that followed was deafening. Dust motes danced in the morning light streaming through the windows, the only movement in the frozen scene. Then Alexander straightened to his full height, his voice steady and clear. "Then let Ella choose for herself." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ella's breath caught in her throat as 3 pairs of eyes turned to her, her father's blazing with fury, Alexander's calm and steady, waiting. In that moment, the weight of decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. On one side stood her father, the man who had raised her, whose approval she'd sought her entire life despite his harsh words and harder judgment. On the other stood Alexander Boone, who had defended her honor, valued her mind, and now offered her the dignity of choice. Her father's scorn or Alexander's faith, security or respect, the known path or the uncertain road. Ella's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of a nearby shelf, steadying herself. The memory of Alexander's single chair, his lonely cabin, and the trust in his eyes when he showed her those documents, washed over her. Then came the echo of her father's words from the night before. "No man will ever truly want you." She looked at Alexander, really looked at him. The scars that marked his face told stories of survival, of a man who had faced the wilderness alone and emerged stronger. But it was the kindness in his eyes that gave her courage, the same kindness that had moved him to defend her that first day on the street. Her father was watching, his face growing darker with each passing second. The choice before her wasn't just about helping Alexander with his papers. It was about who she would become, the meek daughter living under her father's thumb, or a woman strong enough to stand beside someone who saw her true worth. The store seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty street as Ella peered out the store window. Her father had retired early with a headache, leaving her to close up. Her hands trembled slightly as she counted out the day's earnings, her mind already racing ahead to her plans for the evening. 2 days had passed since Alexander's confrontation with her father. 2 days of icy silence at home, of meaningful glances exchanged across the street, of letters slipped between sacks of flour and coffee beans. Alexander needed her help, and she had made her choice. The town clock struck 7. Ella moved quickly, stacking the last crates and sweeping the wooden floor one final time. She penned a note, "Gone to evening prayer meeting," and left it on the counter. The lie settled heavy in her stomach, but she squared her shoulders and slipped out the back door. Alexander waited in the shadows of the livery stable, holding the reins of his massive draft horse. The beast's dark coat blended with the gathering dusk, but its white stockinged feet gleamed like moonlight. "Evening, Miss Ella," he said softly, helping her mount. His hands were strong and sure, treating her with a gentleness that made her throat tight. He swung up behind her, and they set off at a steady walk, keeping to the quieter streets until they cleared the edge of town. The evening air carried the scent of sage and early autumn, crisp and sweet. Ella felt Alexander's solid presence at her back, steady as a mountain. His arms bracketed her as he held the reins, neither crowding nor distant, just there, like he had always been there. "I found more stakes yesterday," he said as they rode. "They're driving them in all along the creek bed, cutting right through Watson's place and the Miller farm." "Show me," Ella replied, her voice firm despite her racing heart. They rode another mile before Alexander reined in. In the fading light, Ella could make out the line of wooden stakes, their white-painted tops catching the last rays of Sunday. They marched in an unnatural straight line across the rolling landscape, crossing creek beds and cutting through grazing land without regard for property lines or water access. "See how they've marked it?" Alexander pointed to where the stakes crossed Simmons Creek. "If they build their track there, it'll dam up the natural flow. Half the farms downstream will lose their water." Ella studied the layout, her mind already calculating angles and elevations. "And the railroad owns the water rights? That's what those papers claim. But the dates don't match up with when folks first settled here. Something's not right with those documents you found." They rode on, the big horse picking its way carefully in the growing darkness. Lights appeared ahead, a small ranch house set back from the road. A woman's figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by lamplight. "Mrs. Callahan," Alexander called out softly. "Hope we're not disturbing you too late." Abigail Callahan stepped onto her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was weathered but kind, creased with the lines of someone who had seen hard times but refused to be broken by them. "Alexander Boone, you're a sight for sore eyes," she said warmly. Then she spotted Ella. "And Miss Dunn, what brings you both out this way?" "The railroad stakes," Alexander replied. "Wanted to show Miss Ella what's happening to the water supply." Mrs. Callahan's face grew serious. "Come in, both of you. You should see for yourself." Inside, the cabin was neat but sparse. A widow's home, kept up through determination rather than means. Mrs. Callahan led them to her back door, where an empty bucket sat beside a dry pump handle. "Used to get sweet, clear water here," she said quietly. "Then the railroad started their work up by Miller's place. Now the wells run dry. First time in 15 years. Ella pulled out her small notebook and pencil. "When did it start failing, Mrs. Callahan?" 3 weeks ago, right after they put in those stakes. First, it turned muddy, then slowed to a trickle. Now nothing." Alexander's jaw tightened. "They're driving away small ranchers, one dry well at a time," Ella wrote quickly, noting dates and details. "May I see your deed, Mrs. Callahan? And any papers from the railroad?" They spent an hour at the widow's table, examining documents by lamplight. Mrs. Callahan served coffee and cornbread, watching with bright eyes as Ella found discrepancies in the railroad's letters. "You've got a sharp mind, Miss Dunn," Mrs. Callahan said warmly. "Don't let anyone tell you different." The ride back to Alexander's ranch was quiet, both of them lost in thought. His small house appeared out of the darkness, a single lamp burning in the window. Inside, Alexander built up the fire while Ella spread her notes on his rough-hewn table. "The dates don't align here either," she said, comparing papers. "See? Mrs. Callahan's water rights were registered 5 years before the railroad claims they owned that section." Alexander moved around his small kitchen, putting together a simple supper of beans, bread, and coffee. The domestic sounds were oddly comforting in the quiet night. "Reckon we've got enough to prove something's wrong," he said, setting a plate before her. "But proving it and getting justice are two different things." They ate together, the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. Ella found herself relaxing, the tension of sneaking out gradually easing from her shoulders. Alexander spoke of his years in the mountains, his voice taking on a different quality as he shared stories of silent peaks and star-filled nights. "Spent 7 years running trap lines," he said, refilling their coffee cups. "Learned every creek and hollow in 3 mountain ranges, but the loneliness." He paused, looking into the fire. "Some nights, the coyotes would sing, and I'd sit by my campfire telling stories to myself, just to hear a human voice." "What kind of stories?" Ella asked softly. A smile touched his scarred face. All kinds. Tales my grandmother told me. Adventures I'd read about, sometimes just making up yarns about the animals I'd see. Had a particular clever fox that used to steal my bait. Gave him a whole history and family tree by the time spring came. Ella laughed, the sound surprising her with its freedom. Alexander's eyes crinkled at the corners, watching her with a warmth that made her cheeks flush. Never thought I'd find someone who'd want to hear those old stories, he said quietly. I want to hear them all, Ella replied, meaning it with her whole heart. They sat together in the firelight, trading tales and ideas, planning their next steps against the railroad's schemes. Alexander treated her thoughts with respect, building on her suggestions, asking her opinion on every point. Not once did he comment on her size or make her feel less than welcome at his table. The clock striking 10 broke their comfortable conversation. Ella gathered her notes reluctantly, knowing she needed to return before her father discovered her absence. Alexander saddled his horse again, helping her mount with the same careful courtesy he'd shown earlier. The ride back was peaceful, the night air cool and sweet around them. Ella found herself leaning back slightly, just enough to feel the solid strength of Alexander's chest behind her. He didn't comment or move away, just adjusted his hold on the reins to make her more comfortable. At the edge of town, he helped her down, his hands lingering just a moment at her waist. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. Ella looked up at him, at the honest gratitude in his eyes, and felt something shift in her heart. Here was a man who saw her mind first, who valued her help, who treated her with a dignity she'd never known she deserved. Same time tomorrow? She asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Alexander's smile was answer enough. She hurried home through the quiet streets, her notebook clutched to her chest, feeling not like someone's burden or shame, but like a woman with purpose, with value, with gifts worth sharing. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not for her size, not for her father's daughter, but for herself. And that feeling, she realized as she slipped quietly into her bed, was worth any risk. Morning sunlight streamed through the general store's front windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air as Ella arranged new shipments of coffee and sugar. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see Mrs. Peterson and her daughter Sarah entering, their heads bent close together in whispered conversation. Did you hear? Sarah's voice carried clearly, despite her attempt at discretion. Out riding alone with that Boone fellow, after dark, no less. Ella's hands trembled as she gripped the coffee tin, but she kept working, pretending not to hear. Mrs. Peterson clicked her tongue. Such shameful behavior. And her poor father, what must he think? They weren't the first to whisper that morning. Since sunrise, Ella had endured sidelong glances and hushed conversations that fell silent. When she drew near, even the usual morning customers seemed to find reasons to delay their shopping, as if her presence might somehow taint their purchases. The store's bell chimed again. 3 cowhands swaggered in, their spurs jingling against the wooden floor. Ella recognized them from the saloon crowd that often gathered at day's end. Morning, Miss Dunn? The tallest one drawled, touching his hat brim with exaggerated politeness. Mighty fine day for riding, ain't it? His companion snickered, and Ella felt heat rise in her cheeks. She turned away, busying herself with the inventory ledger. Guess even mountain men get lonely enough to take what they can get, one muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Mrs. Peterson and Sarah tittered behind their hands. Ella's vision blurred with unshed tears, but she squared her shoulders and kept writing, her pencil pressing so hard it nearly tore the page. The bell chimed once more. Heavy boots crossed the threshold, and a sudden hush fell over the store. Ella didn't need to look up to know who had entered. She could feel Alexander's presence like a shift in the air. Miss Dunn, his deep voice carried clearly through the silence. I wonder if you might help me with an order. Ella turned, finding Alexander standing tall and straight, his scarred face set in lines of quiet dignity. He'd cleaned up. She noticed his shirt was fresh, his beard trimmed neat. Of course, Mr. Boone, she managed, proud that her voice remained steady. The cowhands exchanged glances but didn't move from their spot near the candy jars. Mrs. Peterson and Sarah watched with undisguised interest as Alexander approached the counter. I'll need supplies for fence mending, he said, pulling out a list written in his careful hand. And some provisions for the house. if you'd be so kind. Ella began gathering his items, grateful for the familiar routine. As she worked, a young rancher, Tom Wilson, whose father owned the spread next to Alexander's, entered the store. He paused just inside the door, taking in the scene. "Well, if it ain't the love-struck Mountain Man," Tom announced with a cruel smile. "Heard you've been giving riding lessons after dark." The cowhands guffawed. "Mrs. Peterson," gasped dramatically, while Sarah whispered something that made her mother's eyes widen. Ella's hands shook as she reached for the top shelf, struggling with a heavy sack of flour. Before she could protest, Alexander was beside her, easily lifting it down. He set it with her other gathered items, then turned to face the store at large. "Miss Dunn," he said clearly, "these parcels look mighty heavy. Would you allow me to carry them for you while you finish the order?" The store fell absolutely silent. Ella stared at him, seeing the quiet strength in his stance, the unwavering look in his eyes. He wasn't asking permission to help, he was asking permission to stand beside her, publicly and without shame. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she said softly. "That's very kind." Tom Wilson made a derisive sound. "Kind ain't the word I'd use." Alexander didn't even glance his way. Instead, he carefully gathered the heaviest items in his arms, standing patient and steady while Ella continued working. The simple domesticity of their movements seemed to confound the onlookers more than any words could have. Mrs. Peterson and Sarah slipped out without making their purchases. The cowhands, finding no further entertainment, soon followed. Tom Wilson lingered longest, but when neither Ella nor Alexander acknowledged his presence, he finally left with a muttered curse. They finished the order in comfortable silence. When everything was tallied and packed, Alexander insisted on carrying it all to the storeroom for her, despite her protests that she could manage. The afternoon sun was lowering when they finally stepped onto the boardwalk. A few townspeople still lingered, watching with undisguised interest as Alexander carefully arranged the last of the supplies. "Mr. Boone," Ella said quietly, mindful of their audience, "I fear I'm destroying your reputation in town. Perhaps it would be better if—" "Miss Dunn," he interrupted gently, straightening to his full height. Then, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear clearly, he tipped his hat and said, "I'll not hide my respect for the finest woman I know." The words hung in the golden evening air like a declaration. Ella felt them settle into her heart, filling spaces she hadn't known were empty. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. "Much obliged," she whispered, her voice hardly more than a breath. Alexander's scarred face softened with understanding. Without another word, he offered his arm. Ella hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in the crook of his elbow, letting him escort her down the boardwalk toward home. They walked slowly, neither speaking, both aware of the eyes following their progress. But for the first time, Ella didn't hunch her shoulders or try to make herself smaller. Alexander's steady presence beside her seemed to lend her his strength, helping her stand tall despite the whispers that followed in their wake. At her door, Alexander released her arm with gentle courtesy. "Until tomorrow, Miss Dunn? Until tomorrow, Mr. Boone." She watched him stride away, his broad shoulders straight and proud in the setting Sunday. Only when she was alone in her room did she press her hands to her heart, feeling it tremble with emotions too big to name. The town's cruelty had not changed. The whispers would continue. The sideways glances and cruel comments would persist. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. Alexander's public declaration of respect had given her something she'd never possessed before the courage to believe she deserved it. The land office smelled of dust and aging paper. Ella sat at a wooden table, carefully examining deed after deed in the flickering lamplight. Alexander stood behind her, his solid presence reassuring as she traced her finger along lines of cramped handwriting. "Look here," she whispered, tapping a page dated 3 months prior. "The signature for Judge Morton. See how the mem swoops differently from his other documents?" Alexander leaned closer, his breath warm near her ear. "You've got keen eyes, Miss Dunn." "And here," she continued, spreading out 2 more pages. These deed pages, the paper's newer, whiter than the rest, like they've been swapped in recent. The county clerk's office was cramped, barely big enough for the heavy oak desk where they worked. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through grimy windows. They'd been at this for days now, spending every spare moment poring over land records. "The railroad men," Alexander said quietly. They're counting on folks not looking close enough, not questioning official papers. Ella nodded, carefully stacking their evidence. But Mrs. Callahan's water rights were listed clear as day in her original deed. These new papers, they're forgeries, plain and simple. You sound mighty certain. There was pride in his voice. Numbers don't lie, Mr. Boone. Neither does handwriting, once you know what to look for. She gathered the papers with trembling hands. We have proof now, real proof. Alexander helped her organize the documents, his scarred fingers gentle with the fragile pages. You've done something remarkable here, Miss Dunn. We both did, she corrected, looking up at him. In the lamp's glow, his face was softer, the old scars less harsh. Reckon we make a fair team, he said with a slight smile. They worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, carefully noting each discrepancy. When they finally emerged from the office, the evening air was cool against Ella's flushed cheeks. The church supper's tomorrow, Alexander said as they walked. Will you be attending? Yes, though Papa's not happy about it. Mrs. Callahan asked specially for my help with the pies. Alexander nodded, seeming lost in thought. Good, that's good. Something in his tone made Ella glance at him curiously, but he just tipped his hat and bid her good night. The next evening, the church hall buzzed with conversation and the clatter of plates. Ladies arranged covered dishes on long tables, while children darted between adult legs. Ella helped Mrs. Callahan set out her promised pies, trying to ignore the whispers that followed her movements. Pay them no mind, dear, Mrs. Callahan murmured, patting Ella's arm. You just hold your head high. The room grew more crowded as ranchers and townspeople filed in. Ella's father arrived late, taking a seat far from where she stood. His disapproval radiated across the room like a physical force. Alexander entered just as the blessing was being said. He'd cleaned up nice, Ella noticed, wearing a fresh shirt and his better boots. He caught her eye and smiled, then took his place among the other ranchers. The meal proceeded with its usual mix of gossip and discussion about weather and cattle prices. Ella ate quietly, grateful for Mrs. Callahan's steady presence beside her. She was just finishing her coffee when Alexander stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. The conversations around him gradually quieted as people noticed his stance. He cleared his throat, and the remaining talk died away. Folks, he began, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hall. I got something to say. Ella's heart began to pound. Alexander's eyes found hers across the room, steady and sure. Some of you know me as a mountain man, a trapper who came down from the high country. Some maybe wonder why I stayed, took up ranching instead. He paused, his gaze never leaving Ella's face. Truth is, I found something worth staying for. The hall grew so quiet you could hear the oil lamps hissing. Ella couldn't breathe. Miss Ella May Dunn, Alexander continued, has shown me more kindness, more wisdom, and more courage than any person I've known. And I'm standing here today to declare, before God and this community, that I intend to make her my wife. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Ella's father's chair crashed backward as he shot to his feet, his face mottled red with fury. Without a word, he stormed toward the door, slamming it behind him so hard the windows rattled. For a moment, nobody moved. Then whispers erupted like a swarm of locusts, spreading through the hall in waves. Ella sat frozen, her cheeks burning, her heart thundering in her chest. The scrape of a chair broke through her daze. Mrs. Callahan had stood up, a fierce pride in her weathered face. She began to clap, slowly at first, then with growing conviction. Well, it's about time, she declared loudly. Those two were made for each other, plain as day. A few other hands joined in the blacksmith's wife, 2 ranchers who'd benefited from Ella's sharp eye for numbers, a handful of others who'd seen past appearances to the truth of their hearts. Alexander crossed the room in long strides, coming to stand beside Ella's chair. He held out his hand, and she took it, rising on shaky legs. I know it's sudden, he said softly, for her ears alone, but I couldn't wait another day without speaking true. Ella looked up into his face, scarred, weathered, and more dear to her than any other. You didn't mind declaring it to everyone, even knowing how they talk? Let them talk. His fingers tightened around hers. I'm proud to stand beside you, Ella May Dunn. Proud to let the whole world know it. More people were clapping now, perhaps caught up in the moment's romance, perhaps simply following Mrs. Callahan's lead. but Ella barely heard them. In Alexander's eyes, she saw something she'd been searching for all her life: complete acceptance, unwavering respect, and a love that asked nothing of her except to be exactly who she was. Mrs. Callahan appeared beside them, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Well now," she said, clearing her throat. "This calls for something special." She disappeared briefly, returning with 2 slices of her best apple pie. Every proper engagement needs celebrating. Ella and Alexander sat together at Mrs. Callahan's table, sharing pie and coffee, while well-wishers gradually approached to offer congratulations. Not everyone came forward, plenty still whispered behind their hands or avoided looking their way entirely, but for the first time in her life, Ella didn't feel the need to hide or make herself smaller. Alexander's hand found hers under the table, warm and strong and steady. She wasn't alone anymore. Whatever came next, her father's anger, the town's judgment, the fight against railroad corruption, they would face it together. The evening continued around them, but Ella hardly noticed. She was too busy feeling the wonderful weight of Alexander's mother's ring on her finger, too caught up in the incredible reality that this man, this good, brave, honest man, had chosen her, publicly and proudly, above all others. For once in her life, she felt truly seen, truly valued, not hidden away like something shameful, but honored and cherished in the light of day. The whispers might continue, but they had lost their power to wound her heart. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the midnight sky when urgent pounding shook the Dunn's front door. Ella jerked awake in her narrow bed, her heart racing at the violent sound. Through thin walls, she heard heavy boots on the porch and her father's gruff voice. "Who's there at this hour?" "Fire!" The voice was young Tommy Watson, who helped at the livery. "Mr. Dunn, sir, it's Boone's barn, railroad men." Ella didn't wait to hear more. She threw on her dress, fingers fumbling with the buttons in the dark. Her boots sat ready by the bed, a habit from years of late-night emergencies at the store. The wooden stairs creaked as she flew down them, nearly colliding with her father in the hallway. "You, stay put," he ordered, but Ella was already pushing past him toward the door. "I will not," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Alexander needs help." The night air hit her face like a slap as she burst onto the porch. Tommy sat astride his lathered horse, pointing frantically toward the hills where Alexander's ranch lay. Even from town, she could see the orange glow painting the sky. Without hesitation, Ella ran for the stable. Her mare nickered in surprise as she threw on the saddle, not bothering with the usual careful check of straps and buckles. Behind her, she heard her father calling her name, but the thunder of hoofbeats drowned him out as she urged her horse into a gallop. The 3-mile ride to Alexander's ranch seemed endless. Each rise in the road revealed the fire's glow growing larger, brighter, more terrible. The smell of burning wood carried on the wind, making her eyes water and her throat tighten. She heard Alexander before she saw him. His deep voice rang out over the crackling flames, shouting orders to the handful of neighbors who'd arrived first. The barn was fully engulfed, timbers groaning as fire ate through the supporting beams. "The horses?" Ella called out as she reined in hard. "Got 'em out." Alexander's face was streaked with soot, his shirt soaked with sweat. But the hay, the tack, the winter feed. A thunderous crash cut him off as the barn's roof collapsed inward. Sparks shot skyward like a swarm of fireflies. The heat was intense enough to make Ella's skin prickle, even from 30 feet away. "Nothing to be done now," said old Mr. Peterson, lowering his empty bucket. "She's gone." Alexander's jaw clenched as he watched years of work burn to ash. Ella moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel him trembling with rage and exhaustion. "Look there," he said quietly, pointing to tracks in the dirt. 3 riders came up from the south, railroad direction. Before Ella could respond, horses approached from the spate, shadows. The riders emerged into the firelight, 3 men, their faces hidden by bandanas. The leader's voice was muffled but clear. "Consider this your warning, Boone. You and your fat little friend keep poking around in railroad business. Next time it won't just be the barn. You yellow-bellied cowards." Ella shot back, fury overwhelming fear. "Threatening honest folk in the dark." The leader wheeled his horse toward her. "Better run home to Daddy, girl. Town ain't big enough for troublemakers like you." Alexander stepped forward, his hand dropping to his hip where Ella knew he kept his revolver. "You've said your piece. Now ride out before I forget my Christian charity." The men laughed, but something in Alexander's tone made them edge their horses backward. "Remember what we said," the leader called. "This is just the start." They melted back into the darkness, hoofbeats fading toward town. Ella released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Around them, the barn continued to burn, casting wild shadows across the ranch yard. "Lord have mercy," murmured Mrs. Peterson, who had arrived with her husband. "What's this world coming to?" The neighbors helped clear burning debris until dawn began to pale the eastern sky. When the last ember was doused, Alexander's barn was nothing but a blackened skeleton. The rich smell of charred timber clung to everything: clothes, hair, skin. Ella's father arrived as the others were leaving, his wagon raising dust in the gray morning light. His face was like stone as he surveyed the destruction. "Get in the wagon, Ella May." "Papa, I need to help. Now." His voice cracked like a whip. "We need to talk." The ride home was silent, save for the wagon wheels creaking. Ella's dress still smelled of smoke, and her eyes burned from more than just the ash. When they reached the store, her father led her around back, away from curious eyes on the street. "This ends today," he said, each word falling like a hammer blow. "No more visits to the ranch. No more helping with documents. And certainly no marriage. Papa, you can't." "I can and I will." He slammed his fist against the wall, making her jump. "You think I don't know what the railroad can do? They'll destroy us all, the store, our name, everything I've built. And for what? Some scarred-up mountain man who can't even protect his own barn?" Tears spilled down Ella's cheeks. "Alexander is a good man. He's fighting for what's right." "Right won't feed you when we're run out of town. Right won't stop them from burning us out too." Her father's voice softened slightly. "I'm trying to protect you, girl. Cut ties with him. Today, permanent-like. I can't." The words came out as a whisper. "I love him, Papa." His face hardened again. "Then you're no daughter of mine. Get inside. There's work to be done." Ella spent the morning in a fog, mechanically stocking shelves and counting inventory. The smell of smoke still clung to her hair, a constant reminder of the night's terror. When the lunch hour lull came, she climbed to the store's loft where they kept extra dry goods. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the high window. Ella sank to her knees in a patch of light, her heart too full of grief and fear for words. The rough wooden floor pressed into her skin as she bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't understand. Alexander and I are fighting for truth, for justice. Why would you let evil men hurt him? Why would you let Papa turn against us?" Tears fell freely now, dotting her smoke-stained dress. "Please, Father, show me what to do. Give me strength to choose right, whatever the cost." The loft remained silent, save for the distant sounds of the street below. No voice from heaven answered her plea. But as Ella knelt there in the dusty light, something settled in her heart, a quiet certainty that love and truth must matter more than fear. She traced the simple ring on her finger, Alexander's mother's ring. The charred smell of timber still clung to her dress, a reminder of how quickly security could burn away. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps real faith meant standing firm when everything else turned to ash. A week dragged by like molasses in winter. Ella tried to keep her mind on the store ledgers, but worry gnawed at her constantly. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when she heard shouts from the street. Through the store window, she saw a cluster of men. At their center stood Alexander, his arms pinned behind him by two railroad toughs she recognized from the night of the barn burning. His face was bloody, his shirt torn. Her heart lurched as she dropped her pencil and rushed outside. "Alexander!" She pushed through the gathering crowd. "What are you doing to him?" Marshal Thompson strode up, his badge gleaming. "Stand back, Miss Dunn. This man's under arrest for stealing railroad property." "That's a lie." Alexander's voice was rough but steady. "I ain't stolen nothin'." One of the toughs, a man called Jenkins, shoved Alexander hard. "Found him with surveying equipment, Marshal. Clear as day. It was on my land." Alexander struggled against their grip. "Put there to mark false boundaries." The marshal's face remained impassive. "Save it for the judge, Boone. You're spending some time in my jail." Ella followed as they dragged Alexander down the dusty street toward the jailhouse. Her skirts caught on wooden planks as she hurried to keep up. Around her, townspeople gathered to watch, whispering and pointing. "Please," she called to the marshal's back. "At least let me tend his wounds." The marshal paused at the jail door. "Once he's secured, Miss Dunn. Not before." The cell door clanged shut with terrible finality. Alexander slumped onto the narrow cot. His breathing labored. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, and bruises were already darkening his jaw. "What happened?" Ella gripped the iron bars, her knuckles white. "Tell me true. Found railroad stakes on my south pasture this morning." Alexander winced as he touched his split lip. "Was pulling them up when those two jumped me. Never even saw them coming." The marshal returned with a tin cup of water. 10 minutes, Miss Dunn. Then he needs rest before the judge arrives." Ella waited until the marshal's boots retreated. "They're trying to stop us from exposing the forged deeds." "Reckon so." Alexander's eyes met hers, fierce despite his injuries. "But I won't back down. Truth's got to matter sometime." "Neither will I," Ella whispered. "I promise, Alexander. I won't abandon you." His large hand covered hers where it gripped the bars. "You're braver than any woman I ever knew, Ella Mae Dunn." "Time's up." The marshal's voice made her jump. Outside, the morning crowd had grown. As Ella emerged from the jailhouse, she heard the snickers and whispers. "Look at her, mooning over a jailbird. Guess even thieves need love. Ain't that sweet? The fat girl's found herself a criminal." Each word stabbed like a needle, but Ella kept her head high as she walked through their midst. Tears burned behind her eyes, yet she refused to let them fall until she was safely inside the store's back room. There, among sacks of flour and barrels of salt, she finally let the sobs come. The bell over the door jingled. Ella hastily wiped her eyes with her apron as her father's heavy steps approached. "I heard about Boone," he said, his voice hard. "Railroad agent was just in. Says they're willing to forget about our support of him if we publicly distance ourselves now." Ella stared at him in disbelief. "You can't mean to side with them, Papa. They planted that equipment. They're trying to steal people's land. What I mean to do is protect this store and you." He grabbed a ledger from the shelf, refusing to meet her eyes. "Railroad's bringing progress, bringing business. We can't afford to be on the wrong side." "The wrong side?" Ella's voice rose. "What about? God's side? What about truth? Truth won't keep food on our table." Her father slammed the ledger down. "I'm done discussing this. You'll stay away from that jail and that man, or so help me, I'll send you to your aunt in Kansas City." He stormed out, leaving Ella alone among the barrels and sacks. The store's back room had always been her refuge, a place where numbers made sense and ledgers balanced clean. Now it felt like a prison of its own. The day crawled by. Ella mechanically served customers, made change, recorded sales. As sunset painted the sky crimson, she lit the lamp at her usual place at the supper table. Her father's chair remained empty. The dining room felt cavernous around her single plate. Shadows danced on the walls as the candle burned lower. Each bite of cold beef and potatoes turned to dust in her mouth. The ticking of the mantel clock echoed like thunder in the silence. Ella pushed her plate away, hardly touched. The fork's clatter against china sounded too loud, too final, like jail cell doors closing, like choices being made. She pulled Alexander's mother's ring from her pocket where she'd hidden it that morning. The simple gold band caught the candlelight, warm against her palm. Tears blurred her vision as she slipped it back onto her finger. "Lord," she whispered into the empty room, "give me strength to stand, whatever comes." The candle guttered, throwing strange shadows across her untouched supper. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. Inside, the choice weighed on her heart like lead. Loyalty to her father, to the safe and familiar life she'd always known. Or loyalty to Alexander, to truth, to what she knew was right. The path ahead looked dark and lonely either way. She touched the ring again, remembering Alexander's bruised face behind those iron bars. His eyes had held such faith in her, such trust. The candle flame danced lower, and Ella sat motionless in her chair. The tick of the clock marked time's slow passage as she wrestled with her heart's deepest loyalties. Every path before her seemed to lead through thorns. The church stood silent against the darkening sky, its weathered steeple reaching toward heaven like a pleading hand. Ella's footsteps echoed hollow on the wooden steps as she climbed toward the door. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the iron latch. Inside, the empty pews stretched before her like shadows. Moonlight filtered through the colored glass windows, painting patches of blue and gold across the floor. The familiar scent of beeswax candles and old hymnals wrapped around her like a forgotten embrace. Ella's legs felt heavy as lead as she moved down the center aisle. Each step stirred dust motes that danced in the pale light. The quiet pressed against her ears, broken only by the soft creak of floorboards beneath her feet. At the altar rail, her knees gave way. She sank down onto the worn cushion, her hands gripping the smooth wood until her knuckles went white. For a long moment, she could only breathe, each breath ragged with unshed tears. "Lord," she finally whispered, her voice catching. "Did you make a mistake with me?" The question hung in the stillness. Ella's shoulders began to shake. "My whole life, people have stared and pointed, called me names, said I was too big, too plain, too much." The words spilled out like water from a broken dam. "Even Papa can't look at me without shame in his eyes. And now Alexander's in jail, and everyone's laughing, and I don't know if I'm strong enough." Her voice cracked. Tears splashed onto the altar rail, darkening the wood. "If you shaped me this way, why? Was it to teach me humility? To keep me from pride?" She pressed her forehead against her clasped hands. "Or did something go wrong when you made me? Am I a mistake you couldn't fix?" The sobs came then, deep and racking, echoing in the empty church. Ella's whole body shook with them, years of hurt and shame pouring out at last. She didn't hear the side door open, didn't notice the soft footsteps approaching until a gentle hand touched her shoulder. "Child." Preacher Morrison's voice was soft as falling snow. "What brings you here so late?" Ella tried to straighten, to wipe away her tears, but they wouldn't stop falling. "I'm sorry, preacher. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "You're disturbing no one but the dust motes." He lowered himself onto the step beside her, his joints creaking like old timber. "And they could use a bit of stirring up now and then." The kindness in his voice only made her cry harder. I had to ask God." "Ask him what, child? If he made a mistake?" The words came out in a whisper. "When he made me like this, so different from everyone else." The preacher was quiet for a long moment. In the silence, an owl called somewhere in the darkness outside. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with memory. "Did I ever tell you about my time before becoming a preacher?" Ella shook her head, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "I was a different man then. Angry, bitter, had a taste for whiskey that led me down some mighty dark paths." He paused, his weathered hands folding in his lap. "One night, in a drunken rage, I hurt someone. Bad. The shame of it nearly destroyed me." Ella turned to look at him, surprised. The preacher she knew was always so gentle, so wise. For years after, I believed that sin marked me forever. Thought surely God could never use someone like me for his work. A sad smile crossed his face. Convinced myself he'd made a mistake in letting me live through that night. "What changed?" Ella asked softly. "One day, I read something in Scripture that shook me to my core. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." His voice grew stronger with each word. "His workmanship, Ella. Not his mistakes, not his afterthoughts. His carefully crafted workmanship." The moonlight shifted, through the windows, casting new patterns across the floor. Preacher Morrison continued, his words gentle but firm. "The Lord makes no mistakes in his workmanship, child. Not in shaping our bodies, not in crafting our souls, not even in allowing our struggles." He squeezed her shoulder. "Every piece of who you are was designed with purpose." "But why?" Ella's voice quavered. "Why make me so different? Why let people mock and hurt me?" "Perhaps because he knew you'd need that strength, that determination born of standing alone." The preacher's eyes were kind. "Look at what you're doing now, standing up against injustice, defending truth, showing courage when others turn away. Would you have that same strength if life had been easier?" Ella considered this, her tears slowly subsiding. She thought of Alexander in his cell, trusting her to help prove his innocence. Thought of Mrs. Callahan and the other farmers counting on her to expose the railroad schemes. The very things that caused you pain, the preacher continued. Maybe the tools God gave you to do His work. Your size gave you strength to carry heavy loads. Your isolation taught you to see past appearances to truth. Your struggle for acceptance made you champion the overlooked. Something shifted in Ella's heart, like ice breaking up in spring. She straightened slowly, drawing a deep breath. Then I'll be His workmanship too, she whispered. The words felt like a vow, like a key turning in a lock. If He made me this way for a purpose, I'll trust that purpose. That's it, child. Preacher Morrison smiled. Let His light shine through exactly who He made you to be. Ella rose from the altar rail, her legs steadier now. The last of her tears had dried on her cheeks, but something warm and certain had taken root in their place. Candlelight from the altar caught the gold of her engagement ring, making it glow like a promise. Thank you, preacher, she said softly, for helping me see. Thank the Lord, child. He's the one who brought you here tonight. Ella moved down the aisle toward the door, her steps more purposeful now. The moonlight touched her face through the windows, and she didn't turn away from its glow. Instead, she lifted her chin, accepting its gentle illumination. At the threshold, she paused, looking back at the old preacher still kneeling at the altar rail. His silhouette was peaceful in the dim light, hands clasped in prayer. The sight filled her with a quiet certainty that carried her out into the night. The streets were empty now, the town silent under the stars, but Ella's heart was full of a new song, a melody of purpose and belonging. She walked home with her head high, no longer bent under the weight of shame. God had made her exactly as she was meant to be, and she would use every ounce of that creation, her size, her strength, her sharp mind, her loving heart to do His work in the world. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, wrapped in the peace of that truth, Ella Mae Dunn walked home beneath the stars, finally at home in her own skin. Dawn light crept through the store's dusty windows as Ella spread the land office papers across the counter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she arranged them in neat rows, each document telling part of a story she now knew by heart. The store wouldn't open for another hour, plenty of time to check everything one final time. She pulled her neat stack of handwritten notes closer, squinting in the gray morning light. The evidence was there, scattered like puzzle pieces across the worn wood. She just had to prove it beyond any doubt. Lord, give me clear eyes, she whispered, smoothing her skirts as she settled onto the high stool. Page by page, she compared dates, signatures, and seals. Her pencil scratched quietly as she made fresh notes, double-checking every detail. The morning sun slowly climbed higher, painting golden rectangles across the floor between the shelves. Then she saw it. Her hand froze mid-note. The seal on one of the crucial deed transfers dated August 15th was wrong. Not obviously wrong, but wrong in a way that made her heart leap. She knew that seal. She'd seen it countless times on store invoices and shipping manifests. The county clerk was away that whole month, she breathed, pressing her finger to the mark. He'd gone east to visit his dying sister. Everyone in town knew it, which meant this document, supposedly signed and sealed by him on August 15th, couldn't possibly be real. Ella's hands shook as she gathered the papers, careful to keep them in order. This was it, the final proof they needed. No wonder railroad agent Hale had seemed so smug about those particular documents. He'd likely counted on no one examining the seals closely enough to spot the forgery. She tucked the bundle carefully into her leather satchel, wrapping it in oilcloth to protect against dust. The county seat was 2 hours away by wagon, but she had to get these papers to the judge today. Alexander had already spent too many nights in that cell. The store bell jingled as her father entered through the back door. "What are you doing?" he demanded, eyes narrowing at her satchel. "I have to go to the county seat," Ella said, lifting her chin. "There's proof here that could free Alexander." Her father's face darkened. "You'll do no such thing. I forbid it." "Papa." Ella's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm going. The railroad men forged these documents, and I can prove it. I won't let an innocent man stay in jail when I can help him." "That man is nothing but trouble," her father spat. "Let him rot." The words struck like physical blows, but Ella stood straighter. "He's a good man who tried to help his neighbors, and I love him." Her father recoiled as if she'd slapped him. Love? What do you know about love? You're just a foolish girl who can read a forged seal when she sees one, Ella cut in. Who knows numbers and contracts better than most men in this town? Who's tired of hiding who she is and what she can do? She moved toward the door, satchel clutched tight. Her father's face was red with fury. If you walk out that door, he warned, don't bother coming back. Ella's hand trembled on the latch, but her voice was steady. Then I reckon I'll need to find somewhere else to live. The morning air hit her face like a splash of cold water as she stepped onto the boardwalk. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe, but she forced herself to walk steadily toward the livery stable. The stable boy helped her hitch up the wagon, eyeing her curiously but asking no questions. As she settled onto the hard wooden seat, she saw Railroad Agent Hale and 2 of his men watching from across the street. Their glares were sharp as knife blades. Ella gathered the reins in trembling hands. Get up, she whispered to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward. The railroad men's eyes followed her as she drove past, but they made no move to stop her. Perhaps they thought she was running errands, or maybe they were too confident in their forged papers to worry. The town fell away behind her as the horses settled into a steady pace. The late autumn sun was warm on her face, but the wind held a bite that made her glad of her heavy shawl. Dust rose in little clouds around the wagon wheels. Every jolt and bump of the rutted road made her clutch the satchel closer. These papers were more precious than gold. Right now, they were Alexander's freedom. Her mind kept returning to him in that cell, waiting and trusting her to help prove his innocence. The 2-hour journey seemed to stretch endlessly. Her back ached from the hard seat, and her hands were sore from gripping the reins. But she kept the horses moving steadily forward, stopping only once to let them drink from a stream. When the county seat finally came into view, Ella's heart lifted. The courthouse stood proud on the town square, its red brick walls, solid as justice itself. She tied the wagon at the hitching post and climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the ride. The courthouse steps seemed to stretch upward forever. Ella paused at the bottom, gathering her courage. Lord, give me strength, she whispered. Then she began to climb. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and old paper. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as she made her way to the clerk's desk. I need to see Judge Harrison, she said firmly. I have evidence of document forgery in a criminal case. The clerk looked up, startled by her directness. He started to protest, but something in Ella's steady gaze made him pause. Wait here, he said finally, and disappeared down the hallway. Ella stood quietly, clutching her satchel. Around her, men in suits hurried past, barely glancing at the large woman in her plain dress. She lifted her chin and waited. After what seemed like hours, the clerk returned. The judge will see you now. Judge Harrison's office was lined with leather-bound law books. The man himself sat behind a massive desk, his gray eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. Young woman, he said. I understand you have evidence to present? Ella's hands shook slightly as she removed the papers from her satchel, but her voice was clear. Yes, Your Honor. These documents prove that Railroad Agent Carter Hale forged signatures and seals on land deeds, the same deeds he's using to accuse Alexander Boone of theft. She laid out the papers carefully, pointing out the mismatched seal. This document is dated August 15th, but County Clerk Jenkins was away that entire month. Everyone in town knows he was visiting his dying sister back east. The judge leaned forward, examining the seal through his spectacles. His expression gave nothing away. Furthermore, Ella continued, her confidence growing, I have copies of legitimate documents showing the true property lines. The railroad survey stakes don't match the legal boundaries at all. For long minutes, the judge studied the papers in silence. Ella stood straight and still, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Finally, he looked up. This is serious evidence of fraud, miss? Dunn, Your Honor. Ella May Dunn. He nodded slowly. Miss Dunn, I'm calling a hearing for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Bring any witnesses who can verify Clerk Jenkins's absence during August. Yes, Your Honor. Relief made her knees weak. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, he warned. Justice must follow its proper course. But I will say, this evidence warrants immediate attention. Ella gathered the papers carefully, tucking them back into her satchel. The afternoon sun was already slanting toward evening as she stepped out of the courthouse. The ride home would be long and tiring, but her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. As she climbed onto the wagon seat, she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Then she clicked to the horses and turned their heads toward home. The road seemed shorter on the return journey, though the sun was setting by the time she reached familiar territory. Purple shadows stretched across the fields, and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky. Ella's back ached fiercely from the long day of travel, but she sat straight and proud. When she passed the railroad men still lounging in front of the saloon, she met their glares without flinching. "Alexander will walk free," she whispered to herself as she unhitched the wagon at the livery stable. The words felt like a promise, solid as the earth beneath her feet. The county courthouse buzzed with whispers as townsfolk filed into the wooden benches. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Ella May sat straight-backed in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Railroad agent Carter Hale lounged near his lawyer, his confident smirk never wavering. The railroad's influence filled the room like smoke, choking hope with its presence. Yet Ella kept her chin high, drawing strength from the memory of Alexander's trust in her. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes swishing as he took his seat. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." After the formalities, the judge fixed his stern gaze on the room. "We're here to examine evidence of fraud in land deed transactions. Miss Dunn, please approach." Ella rose on shaky legs, clutching her satchel of documents. The floorboards creaked under her steps, and she felt every eye in the room boring into her back. Some folks whispered behind their hands, the same people who'd mocked her size for years. Now they would see her strength. "Your Honor," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, "I have proof that railroad agent Hale forged signatures and seals on multiple land deeds." She spread the papers carefully on the judge's desk. This seal, dated August 15th, was stamped when County Clerk Jenkins was away visiting his dying sister in Ohio. The judge examined the documents through his spectacles. "Mr. Jenkins, please stand." The county clerk rose from his seat. "Yes, Your Honor. I was indeed in Ohio that entire month. My sister passed on August 23rd. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Hale's smirk flickered for the first time. "Furthermore," Ella continued, gaining confidence, "these survey maps show the true property lines. The railroad stakes cut through legal homestead claims, deliberately blocking water access." She laid out more papers, pointing to specific markings. The railroad's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! This woman has no legal training, but she can read," the judge cut in sharply. "And these documents speak clearly enough," the lawyer sputtered, his face reddening. Hale leaned forward to whisper urgently in his ear. "Your Honor," the lawyer tried again, "perhaps some simple misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" The judge's voice cracked like a whip. "These are deliberate forgeries, sir. Multiple counts of fraud." He turned to the bailiff. "Release Mr. Boone immediately." The courtroom erupted in exclamations. Ella's heart leaped as the bailiff hurried out. She caught a glimpse of her father at the back of the room, his face ashen with shame as he watched his daughter stand victorious. Minutes later, the side door opened. Alexander stumbled into the sunlight, squinting after days in the dim jail cell. His beard was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, but his eyes found Ella's instantly. She ran to him, propriety forgotten. His arms wrapped around her, strong and sure, as scattered applause broke out. Not everyone cheered, some townsfolk muttered darkly about trouble and shame, but Ella barely heard them through the joy singing in her heart. "I knew you'd do it," Alexander whispered against her hair. "My brave, brilliant woman." The judge's gavel crashed down. "Order. Mr. Hale, you will remain in custody pending further investigation. This court will reconvene next week to address damages owed to affected landowners." As the bailiff led Hale away in handcuffs, the man's confident mask finally cracked. He shot Ella a look of pure venom, but she stood tall beside Alexander, unafraid at last. People filed out of the courthouse in clusters, their excited chatter filling the street. Some nodded respectfully to Ella and Alexander. Others hurried past with averted eyes. The town's opinion seemed split right down the middle, like a fence line between two properties. The afternoon sun was westering when they heard it, the church bell pealing out across the valley. The sound rang clear and joyful, echoing off the hills. Alexander squeezed Ella's hand. "That'll be Preacher Thompson," he said softly. "Celebrating justice done." Ella watched her father slip away down a side street, shoulders bent. Her heart ached, but she lifted her chin. She had chosen truth over fear, love over shame. The bells' song filled the air with hope, ringing out the old day and welcoming whatever tomorrow might bring. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows on Ella's bedroom wall as she sat brushing her hair, her mind still whirling from the day's events. The wooden floorboards outside her door creaked, followed by a hesitant knock. "Come in," she called softly, setting down her brush. Her father stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders hunched, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. The proud store owner who'd ruled their home with stern words now seemed diminished, his eyes red-rimmed in the lamplight. "Ella May," he began, his voice catching. He cleared his throat and tried again. "May I speak with you?" She nodded, gesturing to the chair beside her small desk. He sat heavily, hands clasped between his knees, staring at the worn floorboards. He swallowed hard. "I've been a cruel father." The words hung in the air between them. Outside, a nightbird called, its lonely song drifting through the open window. "When your mama passed, I promised to protect you." His voice trembled. "But fear got the better of me. Fear that no man would truly want you, that you'd end up alone and hurting. Fear of losing the store if we crossed the railroad." He looked up, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. "I let that fear turn to cruelty. I'm so sorry, daughter." Ella's own eyes welled up as she watched this proud man crumble before her. The hurt of years stretched between them like a canyon, yet something in her heart reached across that divide. "I was wrong about Alexander," he continued. "Wrong about you. You showed more courage in that courthouse than I've shown in 20 years of running the store." His hands shook as he wiped his eyes. "Can you forgive an old fool of a father?" Ella rose from her chair and knelt beside him, taking his calloused hands in hers. "Papa," she said gently, "I forgive you." She squeezed his fingers. "But I need you to understand I must choose my own path now. God made me exactly as he intended, and Alexander sees that truth." Her father nodded, squeezing her hands back. "You're right. You're so much like your mama, she always knew her own mind too." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I reckon it's time I learned to trust my daughter's judgment." They sat together in the quiet room, the weight of years lifting like morning mist off the prairie. When her father finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "That Alexander Boone, he's a good man. I was wrong not to see it sooner." Dawn broke clear and bright the next morning. Ella and Alexander stood surveying the charred remains of his barn, the autumn wind carrying the lingering scent of smoke across the yard. But they weren't alone for long. The sound of wagon wheels drew their attention. Mrs. Callahan's buggy appeared first, loaded with fresh-cut lumber. Behind her came the Cooper brothers with their team of horses, more planks rattling in their wagon bed. Then came others, ranchers, shopkeepers, even some who'd whispered against them days before. "Thought you might need some help rebuilding," said Tom Cooper, tipping his hat to Ella. His wife Sarah climbed down from their wagon, carrying a basket of biscuits and cold chicken. "Least we can do, after what you both did exposing that railroad scheme." Alexander stood stunned as more wagons arrived. Men began unloading lumber and tools, while women set up tables with food and drink. Children darted between the adults, eager to help carry smaller items. "We brought nails," called Mrs. Callahan, her eyes twinkling. "Borrowed them from your papa's store, Ella May," he said to put them on his account. Ella's heart swelled as she watched the community come together. Even those who'd mocked her size now nodded respectfully, seeing her strength at last. The sound of hammers rang out across the homestead, punctuated by calls for tools and friendly banter. Alexander worked alongside the other men, his quiet dignity winning over former doubters. Ella moved between groups, organizing supplies and directing efforts with natural authority. Nobody questioned her leadership now they'd seen what she could accomplish in that courthouse. By mid-morning, the frame of the new barn began taking shape against the Colorado sky. Laughter drifted across the yard as neighbors shared stories and broke bread together. The homestead, so recently scarred by violence, filled with the sounds of healing and hope, Sarah Cooper sidled up to Ella as she arranged more food on the tables. "You know," she said quietly, "I reckon we all misjudged you something fierce. Takes real courage to stand up like you did. And the way Alexander looks at you." She smiled warmly. "Well, that's the kind of love most folks only dream about." Golden lamplight filled the small church, casting warm shadows across wooden pews packed with townsfolk. The late autumn evening pressed dark against the windows, but inside, dozens of oil lamps created a gentle glow. Whispers rustled through the congregation, some still tinged with judgment, but many now carried smiles and approval. Ella May stood before the altar in a cream-colored dress her father had ordered special from Denver. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a small bouquet of late wildflowers Mrs. Callahan had gathered. Alexander stood tall beside her, his scarred face transformed by joy, wearing a new black suit that somehow made him look both distinguished and a bit uncomfortable. The preacher's voice rang clear through the chapel. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Alexander's rough hand shook as he slipped the simple gold band onto Ella's finger. His eyes never left hers, full of wonder and devotion that made her heart swell. When they sealed their vows with a kiss, a few happy tears spilled down her cheeks. The reception filled the church basement with warmth and the smell of fresh-baked pies. Lanterns hung from every beam, their light dancing across loaded tables where the community had brought their best dishes to share. Even those who'd once mocked now offered congratulations, won over by the couple's quiet dignity and faithful hearts. Ella rose from her seat, lifting her tin cup high. "Well," she announced with a mischievous glint in her eye, "I told you I was too fat for you." The room fell silent for a heartbeat before Alexander's grin spread wide across his face. "And I told you," he declared loudly, "your body drives me wild." The basement erupted in laughter and joyful tears. Even her father chuckled, shaking his head with newfound acceptance. Outside, paper lanterns swayed in the gentle night breeze as Ella and Alexander stepped into the darkness together. Their figures cast long shadows in the golden light, walking tall with dignity, their hearts full of faith and hope for the life ahead. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines, it's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.